Welcome back as we continue our journey of reading through the book The Bible Jesus Read by Philip Yancey. And hopefully you're really enjoying it. We're now in part 4, Psalms, Spirituality in Every Key. So, chapter 4. It starts off with a quote from John Mogabgab. I'm not good at pronouncing things. It says, if the Psalms have been a source of spiritual instruction and consolation for many seekers, they have filled others with discomfort and bewilderment. There is an untidiness, a turbulence, an undertow of mystery in these ancient prayers. So let's get started. I have a confession to make. For years I avoided the book of Psalms. I knew that many Christians looked upon it as their favorite biblical book, that the church had incorporated these poems into public worship, and that overtones from the King James Version of Psalms still reverberates beautifully throughout the language. To this day, many editions of the New Testament include Psalms as well, as if it represents an indispensable core of the faith. Yet, hard as I tried, I could never get excited about actually reading Psalms. And people around me used to use the book as a spiritual medicine cabinet. If you feel depressed, read Psalm 37. If your health fails, try Psalm 121. An approach that never worked for me. With uncanny consistency, I would land on a psalm that aggravated rather than cured my problem. Martin Marty judges at least half the psalms to be wintry in tone. And when feeling low, I would accidentally turn to one of the winteriest and end up frostily depressed. The length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have strength, prayed Moses in one such psalm. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow. Concerned about my bad attitude, I tried an experiment one summer. I was scheduled to spend the month of June in Breckenridge, Colorado, a postcard perfect town situated almost 2 miles high in the Rocky Mountains. I decided to rise early each morning, drive a few miles outside town to some pristine wilderness setting, and there read 10 psalms in a row. Surely, I thought, mountain sunrises, magnificent backdrop for my meditations would melt the block that had always kept me from reading the Psalms. Each day I listened to birds make their wake-up announcements and watched the sun with the snow-capped pink, then orange, and then blazing white. One morning I sat beside a pond as a family of beavers made repairs to an elaborate series of dams. Another time, a 10-point deer wandered directly in front of me and drank from a mountain stream. I would like to report that this experience transformed my attitude towards Psalms. I came away with stunning visual memories and a renewed spirit of worship, but alas, reading the book itself frustrated rather than inspired me. More than anything, I felt confused while reading Psalms, especially because I had committed to 10 in a row. Individual psalms seemed to contradict each other violently. Psalms of bleak despair abutted psalms of soaring joy, as if the scribes had arranged them with a mockingly Hegelian sense of humor. On the first day of, for example, my spirits rose as I read Psalm 8. When I consider your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set into place. What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? The moon, silvery bright against an azure sky, still hung suspended above a 14,000-foot peak. The night before, the Milky Way had stretched across the sky like a highway of lights amid the grandeur and huge expanse of alpine scenery. I found myself marveling along with the psalmist at our favored human role in the creation drama. The next psalm continued in the same spirit, praising God for his eternal reign, his fairness in judging the world, his mercy to the oppressed, his trustworthiness. And then suddenly, with Psalm 10, the mood abruptly shifted. Just before ending my meditations, I encountered these jarring words, "Why, O Lord, do you stand off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" From those doubts, the psalmist dives into a vicious description of wicked men and demands that God break the arm of the wicked and the evil man. So much for my state of serenity and worship. To complicate matters, I learned from a study Bible that Psalm 9 and 10 were possibly written as one psalm. The contrary moods tugged against each other within the very same poem. Every day I faced the same pattern of glaring contradictions. Instead of beginning the day with devotional peace, I felt swept along on an emotional roller coaster, plummeting to the depths of despair and soaring to the heights of praise, all in the same 1 hour period. That, combined with the thin mountain air and possible overdose of coffee, left me feeling slightly buzzed for the remainder of the day. After a week of this practice, I ran into another problem. The Psalms started to sound boring and repetitious. Why, I wondered, did the Bible need 150 Psalms? Wouldn't 15 suffice to cover the basic content? I struggled through my 10 Psalms every day, but left Breckenridge with an even worse attitude toward Psalms. My experiment had failed. In guilt-ridden evangelical fashion, I blamed myself, not the Bible, for my failure. Back in the flatland of Illinois, I tried a new approach, studying the book systematically. I learned to appreciate the poetic craftsmanship involved in Hebrew parallelism and in acrostic form. I learned to differentiate the types of psalms: imprecatory psalms, psalms of lament, psalms of ascent, royal psalms, thank offering psalms. I learned the various ways of explaining the problem psalms. After acquiring all this knowledge, I read the psalms with a heightened sense of comprehension, but no heightened sense of enjoyment. As a result, for years I simply avoided the book. You can find a psalm that says anything, I reasoned. Matter of fact, you can find a dozen psalms that say the very same thing. Why bother with them? Reading over someone's shoulder. I now realize how impoverished was that view, and my fixation with the details of the Psalms, their categories, interpretive meaning, logical consistency, poetic form. I had missed the main point, which is that the book of Psalms comprises a sampling of spiritual journals, much like personal letters to God. I had lacked a lens through which to view the book. I must read them as an over-the-shoulder reader, since the intended audience was not other people, but God. Even the Psalms for public use were designed as corporate prayers. For them to God represented the primary audience. I suppose I had been trying subconsciously to fit the Psalms into a scriptural grid established by the Apostle Paul. These, however, are not pronouncements from on high, delivered with full apostolic authority on matters of faith and practice. They are personal prayers in the form of poetry, written by a variety of people: peasants, kings, professional musicians, rank amateurs, in wildly fluctuating moods. Job and Deuteronomy offer the extraordinary cases of two renowned righteous men trying to relate to God through difficult times. Psalms gives examples of ordinary people struggling mightily to align what they believe about God with what they actually experience. Sometimes the authors are vindictive, sometimes self-righteous, and sometimes paranoid, and sometimes petty. Don't misunderstand me. I don't believe that Psalms to be any less valuable or less inspired than Paul's letters of the Gospels. Nevertheless, the Psalms do use an inherently different approach. Not so much representing God to the people as the people representing themselves to God. Yet Psalms belongs as part of God's Word, but in the same way Job or Ecclesiastes belongs. We read the speeches of Job's friends, accurate recordings of misguided thinking, in a different way than we read the Sermon on the Mount. The Psalms do not theologize, writes Kathleen Norris in The Cloister Walk. One reason for this is that the Psalms are poetry, and poetry's function is not to explain, but to offer images and stories that resonate with our lives. Understanding this distinction changed the way I read Psalms. Formerly, I had approached the book as a graduate student, as they might approach a textbook. I skimmed the poetry in search of correct and important concepts to be noted and neatly classified. Psalms resist such systemization and will, I think, drive mad anyone who tries to wrest from it a rigid organizational scheme. I learned to approach the book in a very different way. Let me illustrate. My father died when I was 13 months old. I have no conscious memories of him and very few mementos from his brief life on earth. I cherished a few fuzzy photos of him holding a fat baby with blonde curls, me, as well as a crude statue he had carved as a boy and a handful of books from his library, among them a worn black Schofield reference Bible. Even now, I can glean something of my father's relationship with God by reading the notes in the margins of the Bible, for he used the white space to record a kind of spiritual journal. He never had me in mind when he wrote those notes, for I did not yet exist. Yet years later, I can be moved, challenged, and convicted as I read about his own relationship with God. The Psalms are more formal than my father's scribbled notes, of course. They came out of common context, God's covenant relationship with Israel, and the authors expressed themselves in beautiful, sometimes highly structured poetry. And now as I read them, I begin by trying to project myself back into the minds of those authors, just as I project myself back into the mind of my father, who wrote those fragmentary notes. Could I pray those prayers? I ask myself. Have I felt this peculiar anguish, this outburst of praise? And then I proceed to think about the situations in which I might pray the psalm in front of me, facing temptation, celebrating a success, harboring a grudge, suffering an injustice. Under what circumstances would the psalm best apply in my life? Any one of the psalms, wrenched from the rest of the book, may mislead. In a thoughtful reflection on Psalm 91 published in Christianity Today, author Neil Plantinga considers its beautiful image of God's protection. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will take refuge. If you make the Most High your dwelling place, even the Lord who is my refuge, then no harm will befall you. Oh, Plantinga muses, what about Christians arrested by the Nazis in World War II, or by the hostile Muslim governments today? How must that psalm sound as they read it on the eve of execution? The psalm's sweeping promises of safety seem patently untrue. Plantinga recalls that Satan himself quoted from this psalm, jerking it out of context, in an attempt to get Jesus to jump from a high place, and Jesus rebuked him with another passage of Scripture. Says Plantinga, what Psalm 91 is express, one of the loveliest, one of the most treasured, but just one of the moods of faith. It's a mood of exuberant confidence in the sheltering providence of God. Probably the psalmist had been protected by God in some dangerous incident, and he is celebrating. On other days and in other moods and in other darker seasons of his life, that same psalmist might have called to God out of despair and a sense of abandonment. Here Plantinga cites Jesus' cry of Psalm 22 from the cross. Psalm 91 gives us only part of the picture and only one of the moods of faith, with a kind of quiet amazement. The psalmist bears witness that under the wings of God, good things happen to bad people. You need another psalm or two to fill in the picture, to cry out that under those same wings, bad things sometimes happen to good people. Psalms, located in the exact center of the Bible, gives us a comprehensive record of life with God through individually fashioned accounts of how spiritual life works. I come to the Psalms not primarily as a student wanting to acquire knowledge, but rather as a fellow pilgrim wanting to acquire relationship. And the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord our God with all of our hearts and all of our souls and all of our minds. And more than any other book in the Bible, Psalms reveals what a heartfelt, soul-starved, single-minded relationship with God looks like. And that's all we have for today. We'll see you next week as we continue reading the Bible Jesus Read by Philip Yancey. Thanks for joining us.